A struggling single mother discovers anonymous envelopes of cash in her mailbox, only to learn they come from the homeless man she once helped who secretly inherited a fortune. Elena's trembling fingers clutched the unmarked envelope as Detective Rodriguez stepped closer, his badge glinting under the harsh porch light. "Ma'am, we need to talk about the money, and about the man who's been watching your house." The crisp October wind whipped through her auburn hair as she stood frozen in her doorway, the fifth mysterious envelope of cash burning in her palm like evidence of a crime she didn't understand. Her 8-year-old daughter Mia peered around her mother's hip, brown eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes when adults whisper in urgent tones. Elena had spent 3 sleepless nights wondering who was leaving these gifts, never imagining that the answer would arrive with flashing red and blue lights painting her modest duplex in emergency colors. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, though her voice cracked with the weight of uncertainty. The detective's expression softened slightly as he noticed Mia clinging to her mother's worn jeans, but his questions continued to pierce through the evening air like shards of glass. Elena's mind raced backward, searching for connections she might have missed, clues that could explain why someone would anonymously slip $2,000 into her mailbox every Friday for the past month. But first, she needed to understand how this strange blessing had become a potential curse. The lunch rush at Danny's diner had been particularly brutal, with Elena's feet screaming inside her secondhand sneakers as she balanced 3 plates on one arm while refilling coffee cups with the other hand. The autumn rain drummed against the windows, creating a soundtrack of desperation that matched her mood perfectly. Tips had been scarce all week, and the final notice from the electric company felt like it was burning a hole in her apron pocket. "Mom's working late again tonight, sweetheart," she had texted her neighbor Mrs. Chen, who watched Mia after school for practically nothing because she understood what it meant to struggle. Elena's ex-husband David had vanished 18 months ago, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises, forcing her to piece together a life from scattered fragments of hope and sheer determination. As she wiped down the last table at closing time, Elena noticed the hunched figure still sitting in the corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Thomas was what the other waitresses called a regular nobody, a homeless man in his 60s who came in every few days, ordered the cheapest item on the menu, and left exact change down to the penny. His weathered face told stories of loss that Elena recognized in her own reflection, and his gentle demeanor had earned him a soft spot in her heart despite management's obvious irritation with his presence. "We're closing up, Thomas," she said gently, approaching his table with a fresh pot of coffee and a to-go cup. "But let me give you one for the road." He looked up with startled blue eyes, as if kindness was something he'd forgotten existed, and Elena felt her chest tighten with familiar empathy. Without thinking, she grabbed the leftover apple pie from the display case and slid it into a takeaway container, adding it to his order despite knowing her manager would dock her pay if he noticed. "You don't have to," Thomas began, his voice rough from years of neglect. "Everyone deserves something sweet," Elena interrupted, pressing the container into his weathered hands along with the coffee. "Besides, it would just go in the trash anyway." The lie came easily because it served a greater truth, and she watched as something shifted behind his tired eyes, a flicker of recognition that someone still saw his humanity. What Elena didn't notice was how Thomas studied her name tag with intense focus, or how he lingered outside the diner's window long after she'd locked up and driven away in her sputtering Honda. She couldn't have known that her simple act of kindness had awakened something profound in a man who'd been invisible to the world for far too long. But she was about to discover that some gestures ripple outward in ways that defy explanation. The first envelope appeared on a Friday morning like a paper miracle tucked between her electric bill and a coupon book she'd never requested. Elena stared at the unmarked white envelope for a full minute before opening it, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from clerical error to elaborate prank. Inside, 20 crisp $100 bills were folded with mechanical precision, accompanied by a note written in careful block letters, "For Mia's future. From someone who remembers kindness." Her hands shook as she counted the money twice, then 3 times, afraid it might disappear if she looked away. $2,000, More than she made in a good month at the diner, sitting on her kitchen counter like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to voice aloud. Mia bounced into the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and a smile that could power the entire neighborhood, oblivious to the minor miracle that had just landed in their lives. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" Mia asked, climbing onto her usual chair and swinging her legs in that carefree way that broke Elena's heart daily, because she knew how rare such innocence had become. "Yeah, baby," Elena whispered, still staring at the money. "We can have whatever you want." But even as she mixed batter and heated the griddle, questions churned in her mind like storm clouds gathering strength.
Who knew about Mia?
Who had been watching them closely enough to understand their struggles? The note's reference to kindness suggested someone she'd helped, but Elena's acts of charity were small and scattered. $1 to a panhandler, a free meal to someone down on their luck, nothing that would warrant such generosity. The paranoia started small, like an itch she couldn't quite reach, manifesting in glances over her shoulder and double checks of the door locks. But the relief of paying bills on time overwhelmed her anxiety, allowing her to sleep peacefully for the first time in months. Until the second envelope arrived. This time, Elena was waiting by the mailbox when the postal truck rounded the corner, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she watched for any sign of unusual activity. The second envelope was identical to the first, unmarked, containing exactly $2,000, with a note that made her blood run cold. "David's debts are not your burden. Someone is watching over you." Her ex-husband's name hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of their explosive final fight when she discovered his gambling addiction and the mountain of debt he'd accumulated in both their names. David had sworn the loan sharks would never find her, that his disappearance would protect her and Mia from the consequences of his choices. Elena had spent 18 months jumping at every unexpected knock, screening every phone call, afraid that his past would come crashing into their fragile new beginning. But this note suggested something else entirely, not a threat, but protection from an unknown guardian angel who somehow knew the intimate details of her private hell. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Mia asked from the front steps, her small voice cutting through Elena's spiraling thoughts like a lifeline back to reality. "Happy tears, sweetheart," Elena managed, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when something really, really good happens." She folded the envelope into her jacket pocket, making a mental note to deposit the money before her rational mind could convince her it was too good to be true. That night, after Mia had fallen asleep clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, Elena found herself walking through downtown, studying the faces of homeless individuals with new intensity. The mystery benefactor's knowledge of David suggested someone who'd been watching her family for longer than she'd realized, someone who understood the weight of secrets she carried alone. Her steps inevitably led her past Danny's diner, where the familiar glow of fluorescent lights spilled onto the rain-soaked sidewalk. Through the window, she could see Thomas in his usual corner booth, methodically eating what looked like the cheapest sandwich on the menu, while reading a newspaper someone had abandoned. The sight of him triggered a memory she'd forgotten, how he'd been in the diner the night she'd received that threatening phone call about David's debts, how his eyes had tracked her conversation with unusual intensity. But Thomas was homeless, surviving on charity and day-old food. The idea that he could be behind envelopes stuffed with cash seemed impossible, even absurd. Or was it? The money's been traced to a bank account opened 6 months ago by Thomas Mitchell Ashworth, Detective Rodriguez explained, his notebook balanced on his knee as he sat across from Elena in her cramped living room. Ring any bells? The name meant nothing to her, but the detective's tone suggested it should, creating another layer of mystery in an already impossible situation. Elena shook her head, acutely aware of Mia listening from the kitchen where she was supposedly doing homework but obviously eavesdropping on every word. "I know a Thomas from the diner where I work, but his last name? I don't think I ever knew it." The admission felt hollow even as she said it, highlighting how little she truly knew about the people who drifted through her daily life. Thomas Mitchell Ashworth inherited $14 million from his estranged brother 3 months ago. The detective continued, watching Elena's face carefully for any sign of recognition or deception. The brother was a tech entrepreneur who died in a skiing accident in Switzerland. No wife, no kids, and apparently the only family he had left was a homeless brother he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. The numbers hit Elena like a physical force, making her sink deeper into her second-hand couch as the implications washed over her in waves. $14 million. Thomas, the man she'd served coffee to dozens of times, the invisible soul she'd shown basic human kindness, had become wealthy beyond imagination while continuing to live on the streets and eat day-old food from a diner that barely tolerated his presence. But that doesn't make sense, Elena whispered, her mind struggling to process the disconnect between Thomas's circumstances and his newfound wealth. If he inherited all that money, why is he still homeless? Why is he giving it away to me? The questions tumbled out faster than she could organize them, each one opening new caverns of confusion in her understanding of the situation. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching concern. That's what we're trying to figure out, Mrs. Vasquez. Because according to the bank records, you're not the only one receiving these gifts. He paused, letting the weight of that revelation settle before continuing. There are at least 12 other families in the city getting similar amounts, all people who showed kindness to Mr. Ashworth during his time on the streets. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Elena absorbed this information, realizing that her private miracle was part of something much larger and more complex than she'd imagined. Thomas wasn't just helping her. He was systematically repaying every act of kindness he'd received during his years of invisibility, creating a network of anonymous generosity that defied conventional understanding. But why maintain the charade of homelessness? And more importantly, what did he want in return? Over the next 3 days, Elena found herself consumed by questions that had no easy answers, her usual routines at the diner interrupted by constant surveillance of Thomas's corner booth. He appeared Tuesday evening as usual, ordering his standard coffee and day-old sandwich, but now Elena noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. His clothes, while worn and mismatched, were clean and recently washed. His hands, though weathered, showed no signs of the deep grime that typically accumulated from life on the streets. Most tellingly, his eyes held a sharpness that suggested careful observation rather than the glazed distance of someone merely surviving. "Thomas," she said, approaching his table with more purpose than she'd ever brought to serving him before. "Can we talk?" Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slid into the opposite seat without waiting for permission, acutely aware that this conversation could change everything about their strange relationship. He looked up from his newspaper with those startling blue eyes, and for the first time, Elena saw recognition there, not just of her as a waitress, but as someone whose life he'd been quietly orchestrating from the shadows. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," he said simply, his voice carrying an educated cadence that seemed at odds with his appearance. "The police came to see me," Elena began, watching as Thomas's face remained carefully neutral despite what must have been surprising news. "They told me about your brother, about the inheritance. Thomas, if you have all that money, why are you still living like this? Why are you giving it away to strangers?" A smile played at the corners of his weathered mouth, the first genuine expression of joy she'd ever seen from him. "Not strangers," he corrected gently. "Angels. People who saw a human being when the rest of the world saw nothing at all." He folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, buying time to organize thoughts that had clearly been rehearsed for this moment. "My brother and we had what you might call philosophical differences about the nature of wealth and responsibility," Thomas continued, his voice taking on a storytelling quality that suggested years of practiced narration. "He believed money was meant to be accumulated, protected, multiplied. I believed it was meant to flow, to heal, to restore balance where it had been lost." The pain in his eyes suggested their conflict had run much deeper than simple disagreement about financial philosophy. Elena leaned forward, drawn into his narrative despite her confusion about his motives. "So, you're living on the streets by choice? Even though you could afford anything you wanted?" The concept seemed impossible, a level of voluntary suffering that defied rational explanation. "I'm conducting an experiment," Thomas said, his eyes brightening with the fervor of someone discussing a passion project. For 15 years, I lived genuinely homeless, genuinely forgotten by society. I learned things about human nature that most people never discover, how cruelty and kindness exist side by side, how small gestures can save lives, how invisible people see everything. He paused, studying Elena's face, as if measuring her capacity to understand what he was about to reveal. When my brother died and left me his fortune, I realized I had been given a unique opportunity to repay every act of kindness I'd received, to prove that generosity creates more generosity, that investing in human decency yields returns that can't be measured in dollars. His voice carried conviction that made Elena believe he genuinely saw himself as conducting some kind of social experiment rather than simply helping people in need. But something in his explanation felt incomplete, as if he were sharing carefully selected portions of a larger truth. "There's something else, isn't there?" Elena asked, her intuition detecting layers beneath Thomas's noble explanation. "This isn't just about repaying kindness or conducting experiments. What aren't you telling me?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross, weighted with the potential to fundamentally alter their understanding of each other. Thomas's composure cracked slightly, revealing vulnerability that transformed his weathered features into something almost childlike. "My brother's will came with conditions," he admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I have 1 year to distribute at least half the inheritance to individuals who demonstrated compassion toward me during my time homeless. If I fail, the money goes to a corporate foundation that will bury it in administrative costs and tax shelters." The revelation hit Elena like a puzzle piece snapping into place, suddenly making sense of Thomas's systematic approach to generosity and his continued presence on the streets. "So you're not just being generous, you're racing against a deadline," she said, understanding flooding through her along with a new kind of concern. 11 months remaining, Thomas confirmed, pulling a worn notebook from his jacket pocket and flipping through pages covered in detailed handwriting. "I've identified 47 individuals who showed me genuine kindness during the past 15 years. Some have moved away, some have died, some I can't locate. Of those I can find, I need to help at least 24 to meet the will's requirements." Elena stared at the notebook, realizing that her name was probably written somewhere among those pages, categorized and evaluated like a case study in human behavior. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead she found herself curious about Thomas's criteria for kindness and wondering what other stories were hidden in his careful documentation. "What happens if you don't meet the deadline?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Thomas closed the notebook and tucked it away, his expression growing distant. "The money disappears into bureaucracy, and I go back to being truly homeless, except this time, I'll be older, more broken, and carrying the weight of all the people I couldn't help." The stark reality of his situation stripped away any romantic notions about his experiment, revealing it as a desperate race against time with consequences that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. "But why continue living on the streets?" Elena pressed. "Why not use some of the money to make yourself comfortable while you're helping others?" "Because the moment I step out of this world, I lose credibility with the people in it," Thomas explained. "If word gets out that I'm wealthy, every kind gesture becomes suspect. Every relationship becomes contaminated by the possibility of ulterior motives. I need to remain Thomas the homeless man, not Thomas the millionaire philanthropist." His logic was sound but troubling, suggesting a level of deception that made Elena question everything about their relationship. How many other recipients of his generosity had no idea they were part of his elaborate scheme? And more importantly, what would happen when his year was up and the truth inevitably came to light? That night, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling while Mia slept peacefully in the next room, her mind churning through the moral implications of Thomas's situation. The money he'd given her had already been spent on overdue bills, school supplies for Mia, and the first decent groceries they'd had in months. If she returned it now, they'd be back to the edge of financial disaster, but keeping it meant becoming complicit in Thomas's deception of other recipients who might not understand the true nature of their windfall. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carmen in Phoenix. "Mom's asking when you're coming for Christmas." I told her money's tight, but she's worried about you and Mia being alone. The message was a painful reminder of all the relationships that had been strained by Elena's financial struggles, all the family gatherings she'd missed because she couldn't afford plane tickets or gifts, all the ways poverty had isolated her from the support systems she desperately needed. With Thomas's money, she could afford to visit her family for the first time in 2 years. Mia could meet her cousins, Elena could hug her mother, and for a few days they could pretend their life wasn't balanced on the edge of catastrophe. But was it right to build temporary happiness on a foundation of secrets and manipulation? The next morning, Elena arrived at the diner early and found Thomas already in his corner booth, reading yesterday's newspaper while nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given everything she now knew about his circumstances, and she wondered how many other customers saw him as nothing more than background noise in their daily routines. "I need to ask you something," she said, sliding into the seat across from him without preamble. "Do the other people you're helping know about your situation? About the inheritance and the deadline and the conditions?" The question felt like stepping onto thin ice, but she needed to understand the full scope of Thomas's experiment before she could decide how to respond to it. Thomas set down his newspaper and met her gaze directly, his blue eyes reflecting a complexity of emotion that suggested he'd been wrestling with similar questions. "Some do, some don't," he admitted. "It depends on the circumstances and the individual. A few have figured it out on their own, like you did. Others have accepted the money without question, just grateful for the help." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I tell people the truth when I think they can handle it, when I believe they'll continue to see me as human rather than just a walking ATM," Thomas continued. "But I've learned that knowledge changes relationships in ways that aren't always positive. Some people become uncomfortable with the power imbalance, others start treating me differently, and a few have tried to manipulate the situation for additional benefits." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the precarious position Thomas had put himself in by trusting her with the truth. "What makes you think I can handle it?" she asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of her character. "Because you're here asking difficult questions instead of just taking the money and running," Thomas replied with a slight smile. "Because you've continued treating me the same way you always have, even after learning about the inheritance. And because you're worried about the other people involved, not just yourself." His faith in her judgment felt like both a compliment and a burden, highlighting the responsibility that came with knowledge of his circumstances. Elena realized that she was now part of Thomas's experiment whether she wanted to be or not, and her choices would affect not just her own family, but potentially dozens of other recipients of his generosity. But the weight of that responsibility paled in comparison to what she was about to discover about Thomas's true motivations. "There's something else you need to know," Thomas said, his voice taking on a gravity that made Elena's stomach clench with anticipation. "About why I chose you specifically, and why the amounts are always exactly $2,000. He pulled out his worn notebook again, but this time he opened it to a page filled with newspaper clippings and printed emails rather than handwritten notes. Elena's breath caught as she recognized her own face in one of the clippings, a photo from the local paper's Community Heroes section from 8 months ago, back when she'd organized a food drive for families affected by the factory layoffs. She'd forgotten about the article entirely, dismissing it as the kind of feel-good fluff that newspapers use to fill space between real stories. "You've been tracking me longer than I realized," she said, though the observation came out more curious than accusatory. The idea that someone had been paying attention to her small efforts to help others felt both flattering and slightly disturbing. $2,000 was the amount your ex-husband stole from Mia's college fund, Thomas said quietly, watching Elena's face for her reaction. "I've been monitoring his activities since he disappeared, trying to understand the full scope of damage he caused to your family." The casual mention of surveillance sent a chill through Elena, highlighting just how much Thomas knew about her private life. "How could you possibly know about?" Elena began, but Thomas cut her off with a raised hand. "Your ex-husband tried to borrow money from me 6 months ago," Thomas explained, his voice carrying a hardness that Elena had never heard before. He found me at a shelter downtown, assumed I was just another desperate homeless person he could exploit with promises of easy returns on investment. He told me all about his beautiful ex-wife and daughter, how he'd ruined their lives with his gambling addiction, how he needed money to make things right with some very dangerous people. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, making her grip the edge of the table to steady herself as waves of anger and fear crashed over her simultaneously. David had been in the city, had been close enough to approach strangers for money, but hadn't bothered to contact her or Mia. The knowledge that he'd reduced their family to a sob story designed to manipulate homeless people into lending him money felt like a new level of betrayal. "What did you tell him?" Elena asked through gritted teeth, afraid of the answer, but needing to know. "I told him I'd help him," Thomas said, his eyes glinting with something that might have been satisfaction. "I gave him $5,000 in cash, told him to meet me the next day for more." He paused, allowing the implications of his statement to sink in before continuing. "Of course, I also made sure to tip off the police about his location and his plans to flee the state with money stolen from his bookie," Thomas added with a slight smile. David Vasquez is currently serving 18 months in county lockup for fraud and violating parole. The dangerous people he owed money to have been compensated for their losses through anonymous donations to their legitimate business interests. Elena stared at Thomas in shock, realizing that he hadn't just been helping her family financially. He'd been systematically dismantling the threats that David's disappearance had left hanging over their lives. The anonymous envelopes weren't just gifts. They were part of a comprehensive protection plan orchestrated by someone who understood the full complexity of her situation. "You've been playing puppet master with my entire life," she whispered, unsure whether to feel grateful or violated by the extent of his intervention. "I've been trying to restore balance," Thomas corrected gently. "Your kindness to me came at a time when I was contemplating giving up entirely, when the weight of invisibility had nearly convinced me that human decency was extinct. You gave me hope when I needed it most, and I wanted to return that gift by removing the obstacles preventing you from building a better life." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been living in a carefully constructed reality shaped by forces she'd never suspected. Every bill she'd paid, every worry that had been eased, every moment of relief she'd experienced over the past month, all of it had been orchestrated by someone she'd barely noticed until now. But as she processed the full scope of Thomas's involvement in her life, Elena realized there was still one crucial question that remained unanswered. "If David's in jail and the threats are neutralized, why are you still giving me money?" Elena asked, her mind racing to understand the continued envelopes that had arrived even after Thomas had supposedly solved her problems. "And why did Detective Rodriguez seem so concerned about you watching my house?" Thomas's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of something that looked almost like panic before his usual composed mask slipped back into place. "The detective spoke to you about surveillance?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that made Elena more suspicious rather than less. "He said you'd been watching my house," Elena confirmed, studying Thomas's face for tells. "He seemed to think it was something I should be worried about." The memory of the detective's serious expression sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, highlighting gaps in Thomas's story that she was only now beginning to recognize. "I may have been observing your neighborhood occasionally," Thomas admitted, his choice of words careful and precise, "to ensure that David's associates weren't causing problems for you and Mia. But I would never do anything to make you feel unsafe." His explanation sounded reasonable, but something in his tone suggested he was editing the truth rather than sharing it completely. Elena leaned back in her seat, creating physical distance as emotional distance began to grow between them. "Thomas, I need you to be completely honest with me. What exactly have you been doing, and why are the police involved?" The question carried an edge of authority that surprised them both, revealing a strength that Elena hadn't known she possessed. For a long moment, Thomas sat in silence, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if it could anchor him to something solid in a conversation that was clearly spiraling beyond his control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of confession that made Elena's pulse quicken with apprehension. 3 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance on your home and workplace, Thomas admitted, his eyes fixed on the table rather than meeting Elena's gaze. I wanted to make sure you were using the money appropriately, that it was genuinely improving your life rather than creating new problems. The admission hung between them like a breach of trust that couldn't be easily repaired. You hired someone to spy on me? Elena's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from other diner patrons before she caught herself and leaned forward to continue in an urgent whisper. Thomas, that's not protection, that's stalking. That's a violation of everything you claim to stand for. I know how it sounds, Thomas said quickly, finally meeting her eyes with an expression of genuine remorse. But I needed to be certain that my help wasn't enabling destructive behavior or attracting unwanted attention from David's former associates. The private investigator was supposed to be discreet, professional. Supposed to be? Elena interrupted, catching the past tense implication in his statement. Thomas's face flushed with embarrassment as he continued. Apparently, he was less subtle than advertised. Your neighbors noticed someone taking photographs, sitting in cars for extended periods, asking questions about your family. When the police investigated the complaints, they traced it back to the bank account I used to pay him. The full picture began to crystallize in Elena's mind, revealing Thomas not as a benevolent guardian angel but as someone whose good intentions had been corrupted by controlling tendencies and poor judgment. The money that had seemed like a miracle now felt tainted by surveillance and manipulation, transforming her gratitude into something approaching betrayal. So, everything you've told me about helping people and restoring balance, that was all just cover for your need to control other people's lives? Elena asked, her voice heavy with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. No, Thomas said firmly, leaning forward with an intensity that made Elena instinctively lean back. Everything I told you about the inheritance and the will's conditions is true. My desire to help people who showed me kindness is genuine. But I also... He paused, struggling to find words for something he'd apparently never articulated before. I also became obsessed with making sure my help was perfect, that it solved every problem and created no new ones, Thomas continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. For 15 years, I had no control over anything in my life, where I slept, what I ate, whether I lived or died. Having money gave me power for the first time, and I may have let that power corrupt my judgment about what constitutes appropriate help versus inappropriate interference. His confession revealed a complexity of motivation that Elena found both understandable and deeply troubling. Thomas wasn't a villain, but he wasn't the selfless benefactor she'd imagined either. He was a damaged person with good intentions and poor boundaries, using wealth as a tool to exert control in ways that felt caring to him, but invasive to others. But even as Elena processed this revelation, she realized that Thomas's story still contained gaps that suggested more secrets yet to be revealed. There's one more thing, Thomas said, his voice so quiet that Elena had to strain to hear him over the ambient noise of the diner. About why I chose your family specifically, and why I've been so invested in your situation. The pause before his last word suggested he was choosing his language carefully, preparing to reveal something that would fundamentally change Elena's understanding of their relationship. Elena felt her stomach drop as she prepared for whatever bombshell Thomas was about to deliver, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from concerning to terrifying. What aren't you telling me? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mia is my granddaughter, Thomas said simply, the words hitting Elena like a physical blow that left her temporarily speechless and struggling to process what she'd just heard. The diner seemed to fade around them as Elena stared at Thomas with new eyes, searching his weathered features for resemblances she'd missed before and trying to reconcile this impossible revelation with everything she thought she knew about her daughter's paternity. That's not possible, she whispered, though even as she said it, memories began shifting in her mind like puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a new configuration. David never told you about his father, Thomas continued, his voice gentle but insistent. About how I lost everything in the tech crash of 2001, how my alcoholism and depression drove away everyone I loved, how I chose the streets rather than face the shame of my failures. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke, transforming his face into something that Elena could suddenly see reflected in Mia's expressions. "You're David's father," Elena said, the statement emerging as both question and accusation as the full scope of Thomas's deception began to dawn on her. "You've been watching your granddaughter grow up while pretending to be a stranger. You've been manipulating our lives while lying about who you are." "I never meant for it to become so complicated," Thomas said, reaching across the table as if to touch Elena's hand before thinking better of it. "When I first saw you at the diner, I recognized you from the photographs David showed me years ago, back when we still spoke occasionally. I came in to see if you were really his wife, if I had a granddaughter I'd never met." Elena jerked backward as if he'd struck her, the violation of her family's privacy feeling like assault that went far beyond financial manipulation. "How long have you been watching us?" she demanded, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. 3 years, Thomas admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been coming to the diner specifically to see you and occasionally catch glimpses of Mia when you brought her in for weekend breakfasts. I told myself I was just checking on family from a distance, that I wasn't causing any harm by observing." The revelation recontextualized every interaction Elena had ever had with Thomas, transforming what she'd believed were chance encounters into a systematic campaign of surveillance by a grandfather who'd abandoned his son and chosen to study his granddaughter like a specimen rather than introduce himself honestly. The kindness she'd shown him hadn't been random compassion. It had been manipulated from the beginning by someone who knew exactly which emotional buttons to press. "Does Mia know?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. "No," Thomas said quickly. "I would never approach her without your permission. But Elena, she deserves to know she has family who cares about her, who wants to be part of her life now that David can't hurt anyone anymore." His plea carried desperation that suggested he'd been rehearsing this argument for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal his true identity and stake his claim to a relationship with his granddaughter. Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. "I need time to think," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and something that might have been grief for the simple story she'd lost. "Don't contact me, don't send any more money, and don't come near my daughter until I decide what to do with this information." As she walked toward the door, Elena could feel Thomas's eyes following her, but she didn't turn around to meet his gaze. The weight of his secrets pressed against her shoulders like a physical burden, and she knew that nothing in her life would ever be simple again. But Thomas's final words stopped her at the threshold, freezing her in place with a revelation that changed everything one last time. "Elena," he called out, his voice carrying across the diner with enough volume to make other patrons look up from their meals. "The will doesn't just require me to help people who are kind to me. It requires me to reconnect with family I abandoned, to repair relationships I destroyed through my own selfishness and addiction." She turned slowly, seeing Thomas not as the homeless man she'd pitied or the wealthy manipulator she discovered, but as a broken father whose inheritance came with the impossible task of earning forgiveness from people he'd hurt decades ago. "If I can't reconnect with at least one family member before the year is up, I lose everything," Thomas continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. "Not just the money, the right to call myself human. My brother's will includes a psychological evaluation clause. If I fail to demonstrate genuine emotional growth and family reconciliation, the inheritance goes to charity, and I'm committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the true stakes of Thomas's situation became clear. This wasn't just about distributing money to deserving recipients. It was about a man fighting for his sanity, his freedom, and his last chance at redemption through relationships he destroyed through years of addiction and abandonment. "So, helping me, watching Mia, all of this, it's not really about kindness or generosity," Elena said, her voice hollow with the realization that even Thomas's most genuine emotions were entangled with self-preservation. "It's about using us to meet the terms of your brother's will and avoid being locked away." "It started that way," Thomas admitted, rising from his seat with the careful movements of someone who'd lived too many years on hard surfaces and cold ground. "But somewhere along the way, Watching you raise my granddaughter with such grace and strength, seeing the woman my son was too broken to appreciate, it became about family. Real family, not just legal obligations. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Elena could no longer trust her ability to distinguish between Thomas's genuine emotions and his desperate need to fulfill his brother's conditions. Every interaction they'd shared was now contaminated by the knowledge of his hidden agenda, making it impossible to know where manipulation ended and authentic feeling began. "I need to go," Elena said, pushing through the diner's door into the cold October air that felt sharp and clean after the suffocating weight of Thomas's revelations. Behind her, she could hear him calling her name, but she didn't slow down until she reached her car and locked the doors between them. That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with the 5 envelopes Thomas had sent her, their contents spread across the surface like evidence in a trial where she served as both judge and jury. $10,000 in crisp bills stared back at her, money that had already been spent on necessities that had transformed her family's daily existence from desperate struggle to manageable stability. Mia's backpack, no longer held together with duct tape, sat by the front door next to new shoes that actually fit her growing feet. The refrigerator hummed with the unfamiliar sound of abundance, stocked with fresh fruits and vegetables that Elena had been able to afford for the first time in months. The electric bill, the water bill, the car payment, all current, all paid, all providing a foundation of security that Elena had almost forgotten was possible. But every dollar now felt tainted by the knowledge of its true source and purpose. The grandfather Mia had never known was trying to buy his way back into their lives, using his inheritance to create a dependency that would make it difficult for Elena to refuse his attempts at reconciliation. The generosity that had seemed like a miracle was revealed as a calculated strategy to fulfill the terms of a will that treated human relationships like business transactions. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I know you need time to process everything. But please consider that Mia deserves to know her family history, and I deserve a chance to be the grandfather I never got to be for her. The money comes with no strings attached. Keep it or return it, your choice. But don't let my mistakes rob her of the chance to know where she comes from. Thomas." Elena stared at the message until the screen went dark, then read it again when it lit up from her touch. The complexity of Thomas's situation: damaged man, desperate father, wealthy benefactor, manipulative observer, defied easy categorization or simple moral judgment. He was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, generous and controlling, honest and deceptive. But beneath all the layers of complication lay one undeniable truth. Mia had a grandfather who wanted to know her, and Elena had to decide whether Thomas's methods disqualified him from that relationship or whether his desire for redemption deserved a chance to prove itself genuine. The sound of Mia's bedroom door opening interrupted Elena's spiraling thoughts, and she quickly gathered the money back into its envelopes as her daughter padded into the kitchen in her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon rabbits that they'd been able to afford because of Thomas's gifts. "Mommy, why do you look sad?" Mia asked, climbing onto Elena's lap with the unconscious trust of a child who'd never doubted her mother's ability to solve any problem that arose. "Just thinking about grown-up stuff, baby," Elena replied, wrapping her arms around her daughter and inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo, also purchased with Thomas's money. "Tell me about school today. Did you finish that art project you were working on?" As Mia launched into an animated description of her drawing of their family, stick figures of Elena and herself standing in front of their house, with no father figure included, Elena found herself wondering what the picture might look like if it included a grandfather. Would Thomas's presence in their lives add richness and connection, or would it introduce complications that could destabilize the fragile peace they'd built together? The question felt impossible to answer, weighted with consequences that extended far beyond Elena's personal feelings about Thomas's deception and manipulation. 3 days later, Elena returned to the diner for her regular shift to find Thomas absent from his usual corner booth, his empty seat serving as a reminder of all the conversations they still needed to have. Her co-workers noticed her distraction as she moved through her tables with mechanical efficiency, serving coffee and taking orders while her mind remained fixed on the impossible decision that awaited her at home. It wasn't until her break that she noticed the man in the expensive suit sitting in Thomas's usual spot, reading a newspaper with a kind of focused attention that suggested he was waiting for something or someone. When he looked up and made eye contact with Elena, she felt a chill of recognition despite never having seen him before. "Ms. Vasquez?" he said, rising from the booth with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to command. "My name is Jonathan Ashworth. I believe you've been in contact with my brother." The family resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same blue eyes, the same careful way of choosing words, the same sense of intelligence operating behind a carefully constructed facade. Elena approached his table cautiously, aware that this conversation would likely determine the trajectory of her family's future in ways she couldn't yet predict. "Thomas mentioned he had a brother," she said carefully, sliding into the seat across from him without invitation. "Had," Jonathan corrected with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I died in a skiing accident in Switzerland 6 months ago." Which makes this conversation rather interesting, don't you think? His casual reference to his own death sent a shock of confusion through Elena, making her question everything Thomas had told her about the inheritance and its origins. "I don't understand," Elena said, though even as she spoke, pieces of a much larger puzzle began arranging themselves in her mind with terrifying clarity. "My brother has been telling people that I died and left him $14 million, Jonathan continued, his voice carrying amusement that seemed inappropriate given the gravity of his words. "In reality, I'm very much alive, very much broke, and very much concerned about Thomas's recent behavior. The inheritance he's been distributing doesn't exist, at least, not in the way he's described it." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, making her grip the edge of the table as the last foundation of Thomas's story crumbled beneath the weight of this impossible truth. "But the money, I've seen it, touched it, spent it. Where did it come from if not from your inheritance?" Jonathan's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching sympathy as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Thomas has been liquidating assets he accumulated during his years on the streets, collecting cans, doing odd jobs, saving every penny with obsessive determination. Over 15 years, he amassed nearly $40,000, which he's been distributing to people he considers deserving." Elena stared at the financial records Jonathan spread across the table, showing a bank account that had grown slowly and steadily through years of meticulous saving, then begun declining rapidly as Thomas made his anonymous gifts. The money that had seemed like miraculous abundance was revealed as the life savings of a man who'd chosen to give away everything he had to people who'd shown him kindness. $40,000, Elena whispered, the number echoing in her mind like a prayer or a curse. "He's giving away his entire life savings, and he's lying about where it came from. But why make up the story about your death and the inheritance?" Because admitting that a homeless man saved enough money to help people would undermine his narrative about society's treatment of the invisible, Jonathan explained, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern for his brother's psychology. "Thomas needs to believe he's conducting a grand experiment in human nature rather than simply being generous with resources he can't afford to lose." The complexity of Thomas's mental state began to crystallize in Elena's understanding. A brilliant man whose years of invisibility and abandonment had created delusions of grandeur that allowed him to frame his desperate generosity as scientific philanthropy. The surveillance, the manipulation, the elaborate backstory, all of it was part of a fantasy that protected him from acknowledging the simple truth that he was sacrificing his future security to repay acts of kindness. "Where does that leave the people he's been helping?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. "What happens when the money runs out and people discover they've been part of his delusion?" Jonathan's expression grew grave as he considered the implications of his brother's actions. "That depends on how they choose to respond to the truth," he said quietly, "and whether Thomas can be convinced to accept help before his generosity destroys his ability to survive." But as Elena processed this latest revelation, she realized that Jonathan's presence at the diner wasn't coincidental, and his knowledge of Thomas's activities suggested a level of surveillance that raised new questions about the Ashworth family's dynamics and motivations. "How do you know so much about Thomas's financial situation?" Elena asked, studying Jonathan's face for tells that might reveal his own hidden agenda. If you're not dead and didn't leave him an inheritance, how are you tracking his spending patterns and recipient lists? Jonathan's carefully composed expression flickered slightly, revealing a moment of uncertainty before his professional mask slipped back into place. I've been monitoring his activities through a private investigator, he admitted, confirming Elena's suspicions about the surveillance that had attracted police attention. You're the one who hired someone to watch my house, Elena said, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a new configuration that cast both brothers in a different light. Thomas told me he hired a PI to make sure I was using the money appropriately, but it was really you trying to understand what he was doing with his savings. Thomas doesn't know I'm aware of his activities, Jonathan confirmed, leaning forward with an intensity that suggested this conversation was more important to him than he'd initially let on. For the past year, I've been trying to understand his psychological state and determine whether intervention is necessary to protect him from his own generosity. Elena felt a familiar chill of recognition as she realized that both Ashworth brothers shared a tendency toward manipulation and surveillance, approaching human relationships as problems to be solved rather than connections to be nurtured. So, you've been spying on him while he's been spying on the people he's helping, she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Is anyone in this situation telling the complete truth about anything? The truth is complicated when you're dealing with someone whose grip on reality has been compromised by years of trauma and isolation, Jonathan replied, his clinical tone suggesting professional training that he hadn't previously mentioned. Thomas exhibits symptoms of grandiose delusions, obsessive-compulsive behaviors related to his charitable activities, and what appears to be severe attachment disorder stemming from his history of abandonment and addiction. The casual deployment of psychological terminology sent another shock of realization through Elena as she understood that Jonathan wasn't just Thomas's concerned brother. He was likely a mental health professional of some kind, approaching Thomas's situation as both family crisis and case study. You're a psychiatrist, Elena said, the statement emerging as both question and accusation. Forensic psychologist, Jonathan corrected. I specialize in evaluating individuals whose mental health issues intersect with legal and financial complications. When I learned about Thomas's systematic distribution of his life savings to strangers, I became concerned that he might be experiencing a psychological break that could leave him vulnerable to exploitation or self-harm. Elena leaned back in her seat, overwhelmed by the revelation that her family had become entangled in what amounted to a psychological evaluation disguised as an inheritance scheme. So this whole time, I've been part of your case study, she said, anger beginning to replace confusion as the full scope of the Ashworth brothers' manipulation became clear. Not a case study, Jonathan said quickly. A genuine attempt to understand Thomas's motivations and assess his mental competency before determining what kind of intervention might be appropriate. He paused, studying Elena's face as if evaluating her emotional state. But I need to ask you some questions about your interactions with Thomas, particularly regarding any statements he's made about persecution, surveillance by government agencies, or beliefs about special powers or missions. The clinical nature of Jonathan's inquiry made Elena feel like a specimen under examination, reducing her relationship with Thomas to data points in a professional assessment. But even as she resented being manipulated by both brothers, she found herself curious about Jonathan's evaluation of Thomas's mental state and concerned about what interventions he might be considering. What happens if you determine that Thomas is having a psychological break? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Involuntary psychiatric hold for evaluation and treatment, Jonathan replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a routine medical procedure, followed by court-ordered guardianship if he's deemed incapable of managing his own affairs. The money he's been distributing would be recovered where possible and placed in a trust for his care. The threat to Thomas's freedom sent a jolt of protective instinct through Elena, despite everything she'd learned about his deception and manipulation. The idea of him being locked away and having his generous impulses pathologized as symptoms of mental illness felt wrong, even if his methods had been questionable. But Jonathan's next words revealed the most disturbing aspect of his investigation yet. I need you to help me gather evidence of Thomas's delusional thinking, Jonathan said, pulling a small recording device from his jacket pocket and placing it on the table between them. Specifically, I need documented proof that he believes in the inheritance story, that he sees himself as conducting scientific research rather than simply being generous, and that he's experiencing grandiose fantasies about his role in other people's lives. Elena stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake, understanding finally that Jonathan's entire approach to her had been orchestrated to turn her into an unwitting informant against Thomas. "You want me to record conversations with him?" she said, her voice flat with the realization that she was being recruited as a participant in what amounted to a betrayal. "I want you to help me determine whether my brother is competent to make his own decisions or whether he needs professional help before he destroys his ability to survive," Jonathan corrected, though his clinical phrasing couldn't disguise the fundamental request that Elena violate Thomas's trust for what Jonathan claimed were therapeutic purposes. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, though she suspected that Jonathan had contingency plans that didn't require her cooperation. "Then I'll be forced to rely on the evidence I've already gathered through surveillance and testimony from other recipients of Thomas's generosity," Jonathan replied, his tone suggesting that Elena's participation was preferred but not essential. "Several people have already expressed concerns about his behavior, his stories about inheritance, and his apparent obsession with tracking the outcomes of his financial gifts." Elena felt sick as she realized that Thomas's systematic kindness had been turned against him, with recipients of his generosity providing evidence that could be used to declare him mentally incompetent. The irony was brutal. His attempt to prove human decency through generous acts had created a paper trail that could be interpreted as proof of delusional thinking. "What about Mia?" Elena asked, grasping for some leverage in a situation where she felt increasingly powerless. "If Thomas is her grandfather, doesn't she have a right to know him before you have him committed?" Jonathan's expression softened slightly, revealing the first genuine emotion Elena had seen from him during their entire conversation. "Thomas abandoned his son when David was 12 years old," he said quietly. "His alcoholism and mental health issues made him an unreliable and often frightening presence in David's life. The pattern of grandiose gestures followed by devastating disappearances damaged David in ways that contributed to his own addiction and abandonment of his family." The revelation hit Elena like a punch to the stomach, highlighting the cyclical nature of abandonment that had shaped 3 generations of the Ashworth family. Thomas's current generosity might be genuine, but it was also part of a pattern of dramatic gestures that had historically preceded devastating departures from the lives of people who learned to depend on him. "So you're saying that letting Thomas into Mia's life would be repeating the same mistakes that damaged David," Elena said, understanding beginning to dawn despite her reluctance to accept Jonathan's assessment. "I'm saying that Thomas's current behavior, the surveillance, the deception, the obsessive monitoring of recipients, suggests that his underlying psychological issues haven't been resolved through years of homelessness and isolation," Jonathan replied. "If anything, his symptoms appear to have intensified, making him potentially more dangerous to the people he claims to want to help." Elena picked up the recording device, feeling its weight as both tool and weapon in a battle she'd never chosen to join. The power to determine Thomas's future rested in her hands, but every choice available to her seemed to carry consequences that would cause harm to someone she'd come to care about despite his flaws and deceptions. But as she considered Jonathan's request, Elena realized that there were still crucial questions about his own motivations and methods that remained unanswered. "Why now?" Elena asked, setting the recording device back on the table without agreeing to use it. "If you've been monitoring Thomas for a year, what changed recently that made intervention necessary?" The question emerged from an instinct that Jonathan's timeline didn't align with his stated concerns about Thomas's mental health. Jonathan's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing uncertainty that suggested Elena had identified a weak point in his carefully constructed narrative. "Thomas's activities have escalated over the past few months," he said, his voice less confident than it had been throughout their conversation. "The amounts he's distributing, the number of recipients, the elaborate surveillance systems, all of it suggests an acceleration toward a crisis point." Or, Elena said, her mind racing as pieces of another puzzle began to arrange themselves, it suggests that someone has been pressuring him to liquidate his savings more quickly than he originally planned. She studied Jonathan's face carefully, watching for micro-expressions that might confirm her growing suspicion about his true role in Thomas's situation. "What are you implying?" Jonathan asked, though his defensive tone suggested he understood exactly what Elena was questioning. "I'm wondering if the private investigator you hired to monitor Thomas has been doing more than just surveillance," Elena said, her voice gaining strength as her theory crystallized. "I'm wondering if someone has been encouraging Thomas's delusions, maybe even feeding him information about potential recipients, pushing him toward more elaborate schemes that would provide evidence of mental instability." The color drained from Jonathan's face as Elena's accusation hit home, confirming her suspicion that his intervention wasn't as altruistic as he'd claimed. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation," he said, reaching for the recording device as if to take it back. Elena was faster, snatching the device and holding it protectively against her chest. "Then explain it to me," she demanded. "Explain why a forensic psychologist would manipulate his homeless brother into accelerating delusional behavior instead of simply offering help and support." For a long moment, Jonathan sat in silence, his professional composure finally cracking to reveal something desperate and calculating underneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the clinical authority he'd displayed earlier. "Thomas has been sitting on $40,000 for 15 years while I've been struggling with student loans, failed investments, and a practice that's barely breaking even," Jonathan admitted, his words tumbling out with the force of a confession he'd been holding back throughout their entire conversation. "When I learned about his savings, I thought I could convince him to loan me money for a legitimate business opportunity." Elena felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place as she understood that Jonathan's concern for Thomas's mental health was secondary to his desire for access to his brother's savings. "But Thomas refused to lend you money," she said, the statement emerging as both question and certainty. "He said he'd already committed his resources to helping people who'd shown him kindness," Jonathan confirmed, his voice bitter with resentment. "He chose strangers over family, charity over blood. So I decided to document his generous impulses as evidence of mental incompetence that would allow me to gain legal guardianship over his finances." The callousness of Jonathan's admission sent a shock of revulsion through Elena, making her understand that Thomas, despite his flaws and deceptions, was surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. His elaborate stories about inheritance and scientific experiments suddenly seemed like reasonable self-protection against family members who would manipulate his mental health struggles for financial gain. "You're going to have your own brother committed so you can steal his life savings," Elena said, her voice heavy with disgust. "I'm going to ensure that Thomas receives appropriate care while preventing him from impoverishing himself through misguided generosity," Jonathan corrected, his clinical language returning as he attempted to reframe his betrayal as medical intervention. Elena stood abruptly, clutching the recording device as she prepared to leave this conversation and everything it represented. But Jonathan's final words stopped her at the edge of the booth, delivering one last manipulation that changed the stakes of her decision. "If you don't help me document Thomas's delusional thinking, I'll be forced to include Mia in my evaluation," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a threat disguised as professional concern. A grandfather with documented mental health issues attempting to establish contact with a minor child through deception and financial manipulation. That's exactly the kind of case that triggers Child Protective Services investigations. The threat to her daughter sent a bolt of protective fury through Elena, making her understand that Jonathan was willing to weaponize every relationship in Thomas's life to achieve his financial goals. But it also crystallized her understanding of what she needed to do next. Elena turned back to face Jonathan, her expression transformed by a determination that surprised them both. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that made Jonathan lean forward with interest. "Thomas does need help, but not the kind you're offering." She pulled out her phone and began recording before Jonathan could react, his startled expression captured along with his next words. "What are you doing?" "Documenting evidence of someone attempting to exploit a vulnerable person for financial gain," Elena replied, keeping her phone trained on Jonathan's face as he realized how completely the situation had shifted. "Specifically, a forensic psychologist who's been manipulating his homeless brother's mental health struggles to justify stealing his life savings. Jonathan reached for her phone, but Elena stepped back quickly, continuing to record as he revealed the desperation beneath his professional facade. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice rising with panic. "Thomas is genuinely unstable. His obsession with helping people, his elaborate surveillance systems, his delusions about conducting scientific experiments are reasonable responses to being exploited and manipulated by someone he should be able to trust," Elena interrupted, her recording capturing Jonathan's admission of his surveillance activities and attempts to document his brother's supposed mental incompetence. "I have enough evidence here to show Detective Rodriguez that the concerning surveillance he was investigating came from you, not Thomas," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as she realized the power she held to protect Thomas from his brother's schemes. "I also have your confession about trying to gain access to Thomas's savings through false mental health evaluations." Jonathan's carefully constructed plan began crumbling as he realized that Elena had turned his own tactics against him, using documentation and recording to protect Thomas rather than exploit him. "You can't prove anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I can prove that you've been lying to both me and the police about your own death, that you've been conducting surveillance on multiple families without their knowledge, and that you've been attempting to manipulate mental health evaluations for financial gain," Elena replied, ending her recording and tucking her phone safely into her pocket. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked, his professional composure finally collapsing entirely to reveal someone who'd gambled everything on a scheme that had backfired spectacularly. Elena considered her options carefully, understanding that she held the power to determine the outcome not just for Thomas and Jonathan, but for her own family's future as well. The decisions she made in the next few moments would ripple outward in ways that would affect multiple lives for years to come. "I want you to disappear from our lives," Elena said finally. "No more surveillance, no more manipulation, no more attempts to have Thomas declared incompetent. And in exchange, I won't share this recording with the police or the state psychology board." Jonathan stared at her in shock, clearly unprepared for Elena to negotiate from a position of strength. "And Thomas," he asked, "what about his delusions and his dangerous behavior?" "Thomas doesn't have delusions," Elena replied with certainty that surprised even herself. "He has a brother who's been gaslighting him and strangers who've been taking advantage of his generosity. But he also has people who care about him enough to help him find better ways to use his resources." As Elena walked away from the diner for the second time that week, she carried with her not just the weight of Thomas's secrets, but the power to shape how his story would end. The money he'd given her family was still in her possession, but now she understood its true cost and value in ways that transformed her relationship to both the gift and the giver. But her final confrontation with Thomas, and her decision about Mia's relationship with her grandfather, still awaited. Elena found Thomas exactly where she expected him to be, sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons from a paper bag that probably contained the remnants of someone else's lunch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, creating a setting that felt both peaceful and melancholic as she approached the man whose generosity had saved her family and whose deceptions had nearly destroyed it. "I met your brother today," Elena said, settling onto the bench beside Thomas, without preamble. She watched his weathered hands freeze in the act of scattering crumbs, his entire body tensing with the recognition that his elaborate construction of lies was finally collapsing. "Jonathan's supposed to be dead," Thomas said quietly, though his voice carried no conviction, only the weary resignation of someone whose last defense had crumbled. "He's very much alive and very interested in your bank account," Elena replied, pulling out her phone and showing Thomas the recording she'd made of his brother's confession. "He's been the one conducting surveillance on the families you've been helping, documenting what he calls your delusional behavior as evidence for a mental competency hearing." Thomas listened to the recording in silence, his face cycling through emotions that ranged from betrayal to understanding to something that might have been relief. When it finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, watching the pigeons peck at the scattered breadcrumbs with mechanical determination. "I knew he wasn't dead," Thomas admitted finally. I made up the inheritance story because I couldn't bear to tell people that I'd saved $40,000 living on the streets while my own brother refused to help me get back on my feet. It seemed more dignified to be a wealthy philanthropist than a homeless man giving away his grocery money. Elena felt her heart break a little at the simplicity of Thomas's deception, understanding that his elaborate lies had been constructed not to manipulate others, but to protect his own dignity in a world that had stripped away most of his self-worth. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" she asked. "Because the truth is that I'm a 62-year-old man with no home, no family, and no future beyond the next meal," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "The only thing I had to offer was money I'd saved by denying myself basic comforts for 15 years. If I told you it came from collecting cans and doing odd jobs, would you have seen it as generous or just pathetic?" Elena considered his question carefully, understanding that Thomas's perception of his own worth had been so damaged by years of invisibility that he couldn't imagine anyone valuing his genuine generosity over the fictional narrative he'd constructed. "I would have seen it as the most generous thing anyone had ever done for my family," she said honestly. "Even knowing that helping you and Mia was partly selfish?" Thomas asked, turning to meet her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "Even understanding that I was trying to be the grandfather to her that I never got to be to David?" Elena felt the complexity of Thomas's motivations settle around her like a weight that was simultaneously burden and blessing. His generosity had been genuine, but it had also been driven by guilt, loneliness, and desperate hope for redemption through relationships he'd destroyed decades earlier. The purity of his gift was complicated by its origins, but that didn't diminish its impact on her family's life. "Especially knowing that," Elena replied, reaching over to take Thomas's weathered hand in hers. "Because it means you understand what you lost when you abandoned David, and you're trying to make sure Mia doesn't lose the same thing." Thomas's eyes filled with tears as Elena's acceptance of his flawed motivations penetrated defenses he'd maintained for years. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered. "From you, from David, from anyone I hurt by choosing alcohol and self-pity over responsibility." "Maybe not," Elena agreed, her honesty cutting through Thomas's self-recrimination without cruelty. "But Mia deserves to know her grandfather, and you deserve a chance to be better than you were. Not perfect, not redeemed, just better." As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Elena found herself making a decision that would bind her family to Thomas's complicated legacy of abandonment and generosity, creating a future that was uncertain but full of possibilities that hadn't existed before his envelopes of cash had appeared in her mailbox. But even as she committed to giving Thomas a chance to prove himself as a grandfather, Elena knew that their story was far from over, and that the most challenging conversations still lay ahead. 6 months later, the coffee shop Thomas had opened with the remainder of his savings buzzed with a quiet energy of early morning regulars, most of whom had no idea that their soft-spoken owner had once lived on the streets or that the barista training program he'd established specifically hired people transitioning out of homelessness. Elena watched from her corner table as Mia helped Thomas arrange pastries in the display case, their easy conversation a testament to the relationship that had grown slowly and carefully over the past half-year. "Grandpa Thomas, why do you always give extra cookies to the sad-looking customers?" Mia asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting through adult euphemisms to the heart of Thomas's continued generosity. "Because sometimes people need sweetness more than they need rules," Thomas replied, his weathered hands gentle as he showed Mia how to arrange the display for maximum appeal. "And because I remember what it felt like when someone gave me something extra when I needed it most." Elena smiled at the exchange, understanding that Thomas was teaching Mia lessons about compassion that couldn't be learned from textbooks or lectures. His past mistakes hadn't been erased by months of consistent presence, but they'd been balanced by daily choices to show up, to be reliable, to earn trust through actions rather than promises. The bell above the door chimed as Detective Rodriguez entered, his expression relaxed rather than official as he approached Elena's table. Over the past 6 months, he'd become something approaching a friend, checking in periodically on the resolution of the case that had brought them together. "How's our reformed surveillance target doing?" Rodriguez asked, nodding toward Thomas and Mia behind the counter. "Still reforming," Elena replied honestly. Some days are better than others. But he's been consistent, and that's what matters most for Mia. She paused, watching as Thomas patiently taught her daughter how to operate the espresso machine under careful supervision. Any word from the brother? Rodriguez asked, though Elena suspected he already knew the answer from his own sources. Jonathan moved to Seattle, Elena confirmed. Apparently decided that forensic psychology wasn't the right career path for him after all. The dry humor in her voice reflected her satisfaction with how thoroughly Jonathan's schemes had collapsed once his manipulations were exposed. Rodriguez chuckled, understanding the subtext of Jonathan's sudden career change and geographic relocation. And the money Thomas gave you decided to keep it? Elena nodded, her decision still feeling complicated despite the months she'd had to process it. Thomas convinced me that returning it would insult the sacrifice he made to help us. He said that rejecting generosity because of its flawed origins was just another form of pride. She gestured toward the coffee shop around them. Besides, he found a better use for what was left than just giving it all away to strangers. The coffee shop represented Thomas's evolution from anonymous benefactor to community member, creating a space where his desire to help others could be channeled into sustainable employment and genuine relationships rather than secretive surveillance and mysterious envelopes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was honest in ways that his previous approach had never been. Mia seems to have adjusted well to having a grandfather, Rodriguez observed, watching as the little girl practiced steaming milk under Thomas's patient guidance. She was ready for more family, Elena replied. And Thomas was ready to be family instead of just playing at it from a distance. The distinction mattered more than Elena had initially realized, highlighting the difference between Thomas's previous role as secret observer and his current position as involved relative. But even as Elena reflected on how much had improved over the past 6 months, she knew that their story was still unfolding, with new challenges and revelations emerging regularly as Thomas continued to navigate the transition from isolation to integration. The unresolved question. As closing time approached and the last customers filtered out into the evening darkness, Elena helped Thomas and Mia clean up the coffee shop while mentally preparing for the conversation she'd been avoiding for weeks. The letter from David's parole officer sat in her purse like an unexploded bomb, its contents threatening to disrupt the fragile stability they'd built together. Thomas, Elena said as they finished wiping down tables, we need to talk about David.